Hi everyone. We're going to do some revision on the USA today, and we're going to focus on the first part of this topic, which is part one, American people and the boom. So you can see your specification here that I'm going to discuss the boom, the reasons why America was so wealthy in this time, the social and cultural developments that went along with this in the 1920s, but also some of this more negative side of society as well, how society was divided and how there were some more problematic things going on in society at this time in America. So the first thing that we're going to talk about, as we've said, is about the reasons why America is so wealthy or prosperous at the time. I know that sometimes students get confused by this word prosperity. By prosperity, we just mean that America was very rich at the time. And you can see a bit of a cycle here that explains why America was so wealthy. Generally, let's say if you start at the very top of this, like the 12 o'clock part of the diagram, any part of this diagram shows you why America became so wealthy at this time and how it became like a self-fulfilling cycle as time went on. So as I say, to start at 12 o'clock, America is selling more at this time for reasons that we'll come to in a moment. Because they're selling more, production goes up. Because production goes up, it might be that there's more jobs available, or the people that are in work at least have very regular wages, perhaps their wages go up. These people then have more money to spend, that drives sales up again, therefore production has to go up again. So you see how this cycle will keep going round and round in this period. And the thing that kickstarts this cycle are the factors that I'm going to talk about now. So the First World War had made America very wealthy. It made America wealthy because America had increased their exports to Britain, but not just Britain, Britain's allies, and also think about that whole British Empire and the other countries' empires that those countries often got many of their goods from places like Britain, but now America fills this gap and begins to sell huge amounts of products to these countries. While the war is over, America's really become a world leader in some industries, such as chemicals and plastics. So before the war, countries like Germany, for instance, have been the world leaders in chemicals, but their production had been so disrupted by the war that once the war ends, people continue to buy American goods because American goods are now the most leading cutting edge things and products available. And this is what happens in the chemicals and plastics industries particularly. Another reason why America becomes so wealthy in the 20s is because of tariffs. We'll see that this actually backfires on them by the time we get to the era of the Wall Street crash. But initially in the early 1920s, it certainly seems to be helping American prosperity. By a tariff, we mean a tax put on goods entering the country. So you can see this in this diagram here. You can see the tariff wall blocking the kind of foreign goods coming into the country. And only when they've paid a tax will they be able to get over and get past that tariff wall. What this does is that cost that's added to that those foreign goods, that extra tax, is then passed on to the consumers. And therefore, foreign goods become more expensive. Basically, tariffs are encouraging the American people with money to spend to buy American produced goods at this time, because the extra taxes that were put on imported goods meant that American goods were cheaper and therefore far more appealing to people. So this is another reason why America is prosperous. Big sales for these American companies as American people buy American goods. Through the 1920s, the Republicans hold the presidency. We get a string of 3 different Republican presidents, and they pursue a variety of policies that help to also keep America prosperous at this time. One thing they do is they cut income tax, and if people have less tax to pay on their salaries, then they have more money in their pockets to spend. So again, this is going to drive those sales up. Industry also benefits from tariffs and low taxation, which leaves more money for investments. Those tariffs that we've just discussed before. And also the American government at this time certainly continued to believe in laissez-faire, meaning that they didn't believe that businesses should face a lot of government interference. So businesses were really left to their own devices to do whatever they wanted to make their businesses most profitable. So for instance, nowadays, while we have to think about like minimum wage, for instance, for workers, back then businesses can do whatever they like to make their companies more profitable. And that means that they're making lots of money in this period, again, making America very wealthy. Mass production is a very important reason as to why America is so wealthy, so prosperous in this period. This was pioneered by Henry Ford in his car factory in Detroit, and he uses this to manufacture his Model T cars, but it's very quickly rolled out to lots of other industries. By mass production, we mean the use of a moving assembly line to make the cost of goods cheaper. So, for instance, you can see this in the car factory that you can see an image of here. And indeed, it's still the same way that that car factories operate today. The chassis, the body of the car will move around, and as it passes various stations with workers, they will do a particular job to the car. This meant that Henry Ford was able to often employ sometimes less skilled workers because you could train them to do just particular different parts, and it's much quicker. Much more quickly now, and this meant that the cars became cheaper, leading to a big boom in sales. Henry Ford said that the secret of his success was that he made his cars cheap enough that even his own workers could afford them. No longer such a luxury item, a big boom in sales because mass production has made them cheaper. Advertising also drives up sales in this period. Now, advertising is a very old thing. They don't invent it in the 1920s, but it is worth noting that new forms of advertising are now beginning to appear. And a lot of these go hand in hand with the things that people are beginning to enjoy doing at this time. So as you said, more people are driving around in cars, so they put billboards at the side of the road. We'll see that more and more people are listening to the radio, so there's advertisements on the radio. And of course, this just keeps people buying, keeps those sales booming. Hire purchase is another reason as to why America is so wealthy at this time. This allowed people to put down a deposit on a product and then pay off the rest in installments. So you can see an example here in the image of like a vacuum cleaner where you have to put $5 down and then pay monthly installments of $5 each. Now, I always try to emphasize to students, this isn't going to make goods cheaper. In fact, you often end up paying a little bit more in terms of interest that you have to pay because they've allowed you to stagger the payments. But the word I would use is this makes it more affordable to people, especially on lower incomes. There's a big difference between telling someone that they need, for instance, $100 for a product. That might seem quite insurmountable to some people at this time. But if you tell them that they need to pay $5 a month, $10 a month, that suddenly becomes perhaps more achievable for people, and again drives these sales up as increasingly even people on lower incomes can afford to buy these consumer goods. The stock market boom is a final reason why America is so wealthy at this time. Lots of people are investing in the stock market, even people who might not normally expect to do so. So there's lots of people, sources from the time of people saying that they went to have their shoes shined on the street, and even the people shining their shoes were talking about the stocks that they were investing in. I've seen clips of very kind of well-to-do Americans saying their chauffeurs are investing in the stock market at this time. So it becomes a very widespread thing, and it becomes a widespread thing because people think it's an easy way to make money at this time. In the 1920s, share prices went up by 300% on average. So Americans hoped that they'd put their money into the market, and the market would rise, and they would make money. And of course, the money that they make, they can then again turn into sales. It also is a good way of providing investment for companies as well. So it again continues with this boom in this period. So you should have lots of ideas from that, hopefully, about why America is so wealthy at this time. So to return to this diagram, we've seen lots of factors driving sales up, haven't we? Things like mass production, making the goods cheaper, driving up sales, advertising driving up sales, hire purchase driving up sales, because it means that even people on lower incomes can afford goods. And of course, when people are buying goods, they're buying American because of the tariffs. So all of these things are combining together to make America very wealthy in this period. Not something that's going to last forever. We know the Wall Street crash will happen in 1929, but for the moment, America seems to be a very prosperous country indeed. And because of this, people have lots of money in their pockets to spend on leisure and entertainment. People have a bit more leisure time than previously, and they have that money in their pockets to spend on it. So this is a topic that I would recommend that when you're revising, don't just assume that you know it. A lot of people know the kind of key things about the different things that people are doing, but try to make sure that you learn kind of names of key people or statistics, for instance. So to run over some of the key developments, jazz music is the big popular music of the age, and it's controversial as well in its way. Older people are very kind of concerned about jazz. Some people say jazz music causes drunkenness. People thought it was very sexual and sexualized, and people were very concerned about it amongst the older generations. But for young people, they love this new jazz music. People are going out and listening to it and enjoying it. People listening to the radio. By 1929, about 10 million American homes have the radio, and people are, some of them of course bought on those hire purchase agreements, but people are tuning in and enjoying those radio shows. Going hand in hand with the new popularity of the radio comes this increase in prominence in sport. You get this big kind of sports stars of the era, like Babe Ruth, who's in the picture here, the basketball star, boxers like Jack Dempsey. And of course, these people draw huge crowds for their sporting events. But of course, now people can listen to them on the radio as well, further driving these people towards real superstardom within this era. Cinema going also becomes incredibly popular in this era. They estimate they're selling at this time about 110 million cinema tickets a week. That's as much as is sold in the UK at the moment in a year. So it's incredibly popular. And again, there are big film stars of the era that people really look up to, people like Rudolph Valentino, Charlie Chaplin. But as I say, when you're revising this, I'll make sure to go to your notes and really carefully not just assume like I know this because I know people listen to jazz music. Try and make sure you know the key names, the key statistics, key years that go along with all this. So standards of living were high in the 1920s for many people. You can see some of the images here of people beginning to have more and more of these consumer goods in their home. But of course, this didn't apply to everyone, and a number of groups were left out of this prosperity. So there are a couple of examples that I've talked about here. Again, there are a few more in your notes as well, but two of the major groups are African Americans. African Americans, one of the major two groups I'm going to talk about are African Americans. African Americans generally are left out of this prosperity of the 1920s, generally because of the racism and prejudice that they continue to face. There's a phrase about them at the time that generally they're the last to be hired, the first to be fired. So in other words, if people were taking on workers, they would hire white people before African Americans, and if there was a downturn and they had to lay people off and sack them, they would again sack their African American workers first. And unlike nowadays, of course, the government's taking a very laissez-faire approach at this time, as we've talked about. There's no protections to stop this happening to you because of your race. So of course this just happens and is very widespread, especially in the South, where a lot of these problems are worst of all. They're targeted by groups like the KKK in this period as well. And of course, I often emphasize to my groups that African Americans, I think, not only because of the prejudice, but also because many of these people are also working in farming and agriculture at this time, for instance, sharecropping. So they're also hit by how badly farm incomes fall in this period as well, which is the other group that I want to talk about. So on the right hand side, you can see farmers. Farmers have a terrible time in the 1920s, by and large, mostly because of overproduction. They'd increased the amount that they were producing because of the high demand during the war, but by the 1920s, there is an oversupply of products. This is because they've used things like combine harvesters and things like this, and they're producing far more within the country. But also with the end of the war, competition revives more as well. So now there's far too much of the crops, far too much of their products on the market, and as a result, the value of it totally collapses. This leads by 1924 to 600,000 farmers becoming bankrupt. And again, back to that laissez-faire idea, the government wants to leave this alone. The government doesn't help, doesn't intervene, believes that the market just has to take its course, that actually if the prices aren't good enough to sustain this many farmers in farming in this period, they believe that the market just needs to take its natural course, and if people end up going bankrupt, then that's the way it has to be. So the government don't step in to help farmers out within this period. Women's lives changed considerably during the 1920s, and these images show some of the reason as to why this is. On the left-hand side, you can see more of a turn of the century image of American women here. And note, for instance, how covered they are. And note, it's not even just kind of like the long skirts, which people often note first of all in contrast to the picture on the right. Notice how they're covered down to their ankles. Notice how their necks are covered over, their hats, they're wearing gloves, boots. There's really, other than their faces, no skin on kind of show at all. On the right hand side, you can see how dress codes are beginning to relax. We need to be careful because this doesn't apply to all women. Many women, especially women living in more rural areas, for instance, do still have more traditional expectations. But for a certain group of especially white, wealthier urban women, these begin to relax. And you can see this in the way that these women on the right-hand side are dressed. These women are a good example of what we see being called the flapper girls at this time, women who are living perhaps in less accordance to traditional expectations. Women's lives change considerably for some people in the 1920s, partly as a result of the work they do during the war. And in the 1920s, the number of working women increased by 25%. In 1920, all women were given the right to vote. And flappers, these new kind of white, wealthy urban women, are smoking in public, dancing the new dances, and are seen to be more sexually liberated. I wouldn't take that last point too far. Women were still at risk of gaining a reputation, but certainly they were seen to perhaps be able to act in more flirtatious ways than was seen as proper for previous generations. Women wear clothing more convenient for activity, so it's not just a superficial thing, that change in clothing that you saw on the previous slide. Also, out with that goes things like the corsets as well. So women are now able to more participate in sport, for instance, and be active. Divorce is made easier, the number of divorces doubled, women are becoming less content to stay at home and put up with bad husbands. Again, I wouldn't take that too far at this point. There would still be a stigma being attached to being divorced, especially again in more conservative, traditional rural areas. But we do see more of an open access to divorce. But most women are still housewives. Most women are confined by quite traditional expectations. Another thing going on in the 1920s is prohibition, and you probably remember already that prohibition is basically the banning of alcohol, although it's a little bit more careful than this. You've got the definition of it on the screen in front of you, and you notice this is notable omission here. They haven't actually banned drinking alcohol. They banned the manufacture of alcohol, making it, selling alcohol, and transporting it. But yet they haven't actually, there's a bit of a loophole here, they haven't actually banned drinking it. But certainly if this is properly enforced, it would be impossible to get hold of. As we know, however, though, this isn't going to be properly enforced. So prohibition was introduced for a number of reasons. And I always like to emphasize to students that this is a gradual process. They don't just kind of wake up one moment after the war and decide, let's ban people trying to consume alcohol. This is a longer term process. And this is a longer term process that had begun in the 19th century through various temperance movements that emerge, stressing the negative effects that alcohol has, particularly on domestic life, particularly on people within the home. So groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, all campaigned against alcohol in this period. And by 1914, 12 states were dry anyway, in that they didn't allow alcohol. During the First World War, this movement now accelerates as people were encouraged not to drink, partly because it encouraged people to be absent from work, and also because some of the leading breweries were German-owned at this time, and therefore people kind of painted it as unpatriotic to give your money to these beer companies. By the end of the war, therefore, 75% of American states were dry, so therefore it's not the massive step that it might first appear to spread this throughout the country. And those supporting prohibition were certainly better organised than their opponents in getting this movement passed. You can see here a few examples of the propaganda that's put out by these temperance movements, by people who want to, by these prohibition movements, people who want to ban alcohol. This was by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. You can see these two men approaching the bartender, and the bartender's kind of indicating behind him, like, what do you want? But you can see what he's got on offer is ruin, disgrace, madness, disease, misery, death, etc. So you can see the kind of negative things that drink is going to bring into people's life. You can see a very emotive one here from the Anti-Saloon League in 1915. This young girl and her brother waiting outside. Daddy's in there waiting for him to come out of the pub. And you can see underneath, wanted a father, a little boy's plea, and this whole thing they've written about how he's waiting for his father to come out of the bar and stop drinking. So despite the fact it didn't seem to be that radical to just extend it that bit further, since so many states were dry anyway. In reality, there are massive problems with enforcing prohibition. Speakeasies, illegal bars continue to serve alcohol. People are also making their own alcohol as well, like moonshine. This, though, people don't kind of regulate this properly. This can be incredibly strong. Lots of people die even from the effects of drinking their homebrewed alcohol at this time, because they make it far, far too strong in this period. Alcohol was also smuggled in through the borders of Canada and Mexico. These people are known as bootleggers, bringing it in across the borders with Canada and Mexico. And of course, sometimes there isn't even a great effort to enforce this law. Prohibition agents are outnumbered, many of them are corrupt. I suppose a fundamental failing with prohibition is that they don't really get enough people believing that really alcohol should be criminalised. And therefore, this is why even prohibition agents, even people who are paid to enforce this, often turn a blind eye. People don't really take this seriously, don't really buy into this idea that alcohol should be a crime. You can see a Prohibition era cartoon here summing this up. The idea of this, if you've ever heard the phrase of someone taking a backhand or a bribe, you can see all these people who are meant to be part of enforcing this taking their backhand as their bribes. The prohibition agents, the ordinary police officers, the politicians, the magistrates, all taking their bribes to continue to turn a blind eye to the alcohol trade. And of course, it's not necessarily ordinary citizens that are paying them off. It's often these gangs that start to make a lot of money out of supplying this illegal alcohol trade. So prohibition fails fundamentally because the American people continue to consume alcohol. Of course, if people have bought into this and believed, yeah, we shouldn't be consuming alcohol, we shouldn't be supporting this trade, of course there wouldn't have been any market for the illegal gangs to consume. There wouldn't have been any point in opening a speakeasy. No one would have come. So fundamentally, I suppose there's a failing in that people continue to consume alcohol. But law enforcers were corrupt as well. Bootleggers, the people smuggling in the alcohol, continue to supply it. Gangsters control the trade through violence and through paying off various key people to turn a blind eye to this. And certainly after the Depression sets in the 1930s, arguments grow to repeal prohibition to help the economy so that legal bars and breweries and all that trade can get going again and provide people with legitimate work. There are also negative attitudes towards race and immigration in this period. So we've already talked a little bit about what happens with African Americans and the KKK targeting them in this period. But also there's increasing attempts to restrict immigration. Before the First World War, there have been no restrictions on immigration into the United States at all. But in the 25 years before 1914, the profile of where these immigrants were coming from began to change. So prior to this, you got a lot of immigration from Northern and Western Europe. So for example, you get big communities of people from the United Kingdom, from the German states, for instance. But now that profile is shifting, and as people try to flee things like poverty and persecution in Southern and Eastern Europe, you get a lot of immigrants arriving from these places. There's a backlash against these people. The people who are already in America characterize these people as less educated. And in 1917, there's a literacy test that's brought in for immigrants. You could take this test in either English or German, again, skewing this towards kind of these groups that are already in the country in huge numbers and beginning to make it more difficult for those arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. And you had to pass this literacy test in order to end. In 1921, they bring in this Emergency Quotas Act, where they limit the number of people admitted to the USA to 3% of the total number of people from that country who had been resident in the USA in 1910. That is a very, very long-winded kind of sentence there. So to turn this into an example, obviously the numbers are far huger than this. But let's say that from Germany, there were 100 people from Germany living in the USA in 1910. You would now allow 3 Germans per year into the country. In reality, what they're doing here is 2 things, and they're quite cleverly skewing this to their preferences. This, of course, is going to put a cap on numbers because, of course, now you're admitting only a certain percentage of the people already in the country. So you have put a cap in place, but you've also skewed that cap because, as we've said, emigration from Northern and Western Europe had been going on in good numbers for the years and years prior to this. It meant that really quotas for people from these areas was still very, very large. Instead, people trying to come from Southern and Eastern Europe, where immigration from these areas have been in smaller numbers until more recently, these people are going to start finding it more difficult to enter the country. And even more so after the National Origins Act of 1924, which cuts the numbers back to 2%, but also moves that measurement year back to 1890. You can see what they've done here. We just said that in the 25 years before 1914, immigrants were increasingly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Well, you take 25 years off 1914 and it takes you to around 1890, doesn't it? So this is what they're trying to do. Measurement year before you got such big numbers arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they put a cap on European immigration to 150,000 per year. And there's also immigrants from other countries as well, with caps on their numbers. So they put caps on Chinese immigration, Mexican immigration, all sorts of things, in an attempt to limit the numbers of people coming to the country, and again skew it towards people who they prefer, these Northern and Western European immigrants. This ties into the Red Scare. Because people fear immigration so much, people are also questioning the values that these people are arriving with as well. So it could be argued that American society has long had a deep mistrust for communism, that it's seen as just totally alien to American values. But after the Russian Revolution in 1917, which is of course a communist revolution, Americans become increasingly fearful of immigrants from Eastern Europe, fearing that they're going to spread communist ideas to the USA. This fear is further accelerated by the fact that in 1919 you start getting strikes across America. There's a series of bomb attacks in the years after 1919 that are blamed on communist and anarchist groups, and the government responded by arresting thousands of suspected communists, and the era of the Red Scare truly kind of began. A good example of what's going on in the Red Scare is the Sacco and Vanzetti case. The Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian anarchists who were accused of being part of a robbery where two men had been killed. Now, the evidence against Sacco and Vanzetti was very flimsy at the time of the trial. You had lots of kind of witnesses contradicting each other, but despite this, both men are convicted and both men are eventually executed. They're given the death penalty to some outrage because people can see that the evidence is quite flimsy. The judge who had sentenced them described them as a pair of anarchist bastards, which perhaps tells you something about the attitude that he had towards them, just for the fact that they had certain political views as well. So certainly people do believe, historians have gone back and forth about whether Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty or not, but certainly the evidence that they're convicted on at the time shows you the levels of prejudice against people holding these different political views. And of course, they had this Southern European background as well. That is the end of this part one of the topic. So we've gone over the boom and all the reasons why America is so wealthy. We've looked at the social and cultural developments, but we've also looked at some of this negative side of society as well, like prohibition, racial tension, the experience of immigrants, the KKK, the Red Scare. Some of these things, of course, I've covered much more briefly, so I haven't gone into great depth on things like the KKK and organised crime. I would recommend that you particularly look up things like that in your notes as well to reinforce this even further. And of course, please come and find your subject teacher or email them if you need any further help on those topics. My advice for your next steps would be to rewatch this video as many times as you need to. Of course, it's quite a big video, so by all means pause it wherever you need to as well. Read your revision guide, complete the associated activity revision guide. Also available in the shared area. Make your own revision notes. I see lots of people using these index cards to make their own revision notes, but then use those to do something active. So test yourself, turn them over, see if you can come back to your revision the next day, copy out what you remember, see where the gaps are, and also look at past paper questions as well. Practice them, or if you don't feel like doing the full practice, even bullet point mind mapping answers will be really, really helpful as well. So good luck for your exams. Thank you for listening. I hope it was helpful. Remember, this is part one on the USA. There's parts 2 and 3 as well. Thank you. Bye.